Hello, class. This is week 4 of History of International Relations. This week we'll be discussing war and other conflicts. Be sure to read Chapter 4 of Nicholson and Chapter 6 of Ziegler. This lecture will be discussing terrorism. Terrorism is a difficult subject to actually discuss. Uh, it's a it's considered a pejorative. It's a value-laden term, and it's difficult to define. In fact, most scholars do not agree what terrorism is. Most countries also have a tendency of disagreeing what terrorism is. The UN is a famous example. The UN actually attempted to define terrorism. Uh, Most third world countries actually wanted to include a definition of aggression, so they wasted a lot of time on trying to define aggression, and they really didn't get anywhere. Even within the United States, what you would consider the national security establishment, such as the Defense Department, the National Security Council, the State Department, various intelligence agencies, Congress, the White House, they all disagree on what terrorism is. They all have their own definition of terrorism. But scholars can agree on certain things, such as terrorism is the threat or the use of violence. Uh, it's indiscriminate violence. It's usually designed to influence a broader audience. It's not exactly the target audience, but a broader range of people. Basically, they want to instill fear among a widespread population. And it usually involves crimes such as murder, kidnapping, uh, hijacking airplanes, which evolved into what we know as skyjacking, which rarely happens today. And I believe it's because of anti terrorism measures that most countries have implemented. Uh, and it also involves arson, destruction of property, uh, certain things like that. And for this course, I have a working definition right here, which we'll use. Uh, Terrorism is the threat or use of indiscriminate violence to achieve political, social, and or religious goals. The violence can take the form of murder, maiming, destruction of property, and denial of freedom. It is intended to influence a much wider audience other than the victims. The act is usually criminal in nature and is to instill fear or create an atmosphere of terror. It should be noted that terrorism is similar to intervention in that it attempts to force the target audience to act in such a way that is not in their interests or to act against their will. That's what we will consider terrorism for this lecture. And there's also a difference between what is known as counterterrorism and anti-terrorism. Anti-terrorism is defensive measures that countries use to combat terrorism. And a great example are the X-ray machines that you find at airports, the security checkpoints at airports, things like that. And also, if you notice, buildings are usually hardened by having concrete posts surround the building at a certain distance that prevents car bombs from hitting the building. Counterterrorism is the actual offensive measures that countries use to combat terrorism. And great example would be the raid at Entebbe, where the Israeli commandos uh, conducted a raid at Entebbe, Uganda, to rescue Israeli or Jewish citizens. So those are examples of counterterrorism raids such as that. And I guess another famous raid would be the raid that eliminated Osama bin Laden. That would be considered counterterrorism. Terrorism itself has a long history. For example, the first known terrorist organization was the Sakati E, or in English, the Zealots. They were in ancient Israel during the Roman occupation. Uh, they were they were Jewish, and they would target Jews that cooperated with the Romans or Roman officials. And the reason why they're called the Sicarii is because of the weapon they chose to use, which was a dagger called a Sicari or a Sicar. And what they would do is they would assassinate their target in a crowded area, usually like a marketplace. So the murder was actually public. People witnessed what happened, and of course, it would cause chaos and panic, and they would blend into the crowd and they would get away that way. Eventually, they were destroyed by the Romans at Masada when the Romans actually besieged the fortress there. Another famous terrorist organization is called the Assassins, which were located in Persia during the 9th to 11th centuries. Um, their leader, which is known as the Old Man of the Mountain, would recruit his followers by giving them hashish, and they would smoke the hash and pass out. And he would drag them up the mountain to this really beautiful spot. Find flowers, beautiful grass, maybe some trees or whatever. Absolutely gorgeous. And when they would come to, he would say, "This is heaven," and this is how he would recruit his followers by stating that this will be a reward if you do my bidding. And he would give them hash again, and they would pass out, and he would drag them back down the mountain again, and they would do what he asked them to do. And their targets were usually Sunni Muslims and Christian crusaders, and they were eventually destroyed by the Mongols. And of course, we can go to around maybe the late 18th to early 19th century, maybe mid 19th century. Uh, the terrorism became known as terrorism around this period, particularly during the French Revolution, uh, the Reign of Terror. Actually, the revolutionaries thought the term terrorism was a positive term because it instilled fear among the counter-revolutionaries or the enemies of the revolution because they were using the guillotine to eliminate their opponents, and it instilled fear among the population. And so they thought, well, government terror was a positive thing. And of course, we all know that uh, government terror or regime terror is not very positive. It's actually a very negative thing uh, because, quite frankly, uh, this is something that fascists or Marxists would use as a weapon uh, to impose their will upon the population. Um, and of course, around this time, when revolutionary terrorism became very popular, particularly in Russia, and the, probably the most famous organization there was known as Narodnaya Volya, which means people's will, and they were an anti-czarist, uh, I guess, sort of a social democrat type of organization. Uh, they wanted to instill democracy in Russia, and so they would target czarist officials, and they succeeded in actually assassinating Tsar Alexander III. No, Tsar Alexander II. They were successful in assassinating Tsar Alexander II, who was known as uh, the liberator because he actually eliminated serfdom. And when they assassinated him, he was on his way to a meeting to establish uh, what I would consider liberalizing the czarist state. I believe he actually was considering establishing a Duma and actually creating a constitutional monarchy rather than the absolute monarchy that Tsarist Russia was. So the Narodnaya Volya, or the Narodniki, uh, blew their chance. This they the Tsar was willing to give up a lot of his power and liberalize Russia, but they eliminated him, and as a result, Tsar Alexander III became Tsar, and he was probably the most repressive of the czars up to that time, and he eventually did eliminate the Narodniki, and of course it gave rise to the social revolutionaries, but they really didn't do much of anything. They actually killed one of their own members, and that was really the only accomplishment that they actually really accomplished. Uh, Tsar's police, the Okhrana, actually infiltrated into their organization, and they were eventually destroyed as a result. Um, and of course, the next phase of terrorism is probably around the 1950s to the 1960s, where you have uh, the big terrorist organizations, particularly in Latin America, because at basically what we would call real guerrilla warfare up to this time, although it was successful in Vietnam and China, it wasn't really successful anywhere else, particularly in Latin America. And the reason why it wasn't particularly good in Latin America is because the vast majority of the people actually lived in the cities. Very few people lived out in the countryside. Uh, and basically, well, it was successful in Cuba, but only in Cuba, and eventually maybe Nicaragua. But it wasn't successful at all in Latin America. And Che Guevara, his death basically brought on what we'd call urban guerrilla warfare, which was essentially terrorism. And the urban guerrillas, they would organize within the cities, and they became massive. 5,000, 6,000 members. And so they were easily infiltrated by the police, and they were eventually eliminated. Uh, the more successful terrorist organizations were usually located in the Middle East. Although they were urban, what they would do is they would form small cells. And that was the best way of using terrorism, if you're going to use terrorism as a tactic, by having small cells that were independent of each other. They didn't know the leadership of each cell, so they would operate independently. And that was the best means of actually conducting terrorism at that time. And Europe copied it, such as the West German Baader Meinhof gang, which became the Red Army faction. They would operate as a small cell, and that was the best means that uh, using those tactics. Of course, with uh, the RAF, they were actually caught. Most of the members were caught at the end, and eventually, uh, European terrorism died off around the 1990s. Um, so I hope that this gives you a little perspective on terrorism. I need to probably discuss terrorism a little bit further in another lecture because I'm running a little bit long on this one. So I'll bid you students a good day, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. And we'll discuss terrorism and guerrilla warfare and other types of conflicts in other lectures. Thank you.